Boldwood presents Prince Philip's Century, 1921 to 2021. Written by Robert Jobson and read by Sam Dastor. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Life is going to go on after me. If I can make life marginally more tolerable for people who come afterwards, or even at the time, I'd be delighted. H.R.H. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Chapter 1. Strength and Stay. There is nothing like it for morale to be reminded that the years are passing, ever more quickly, and that bits are beginning to drop off the ancient frame. But it is nice to be remembered at all. Philip's response to being awarded an Oldie of the Year award in 2011. Throughout his long and eventful life, Prince Philip had been a stickler for precision and military detail. The arrangements for his death and funeral, he vowed, would be no different. He could not abide commotion and confusion. He loathed it as much as he did in receiving personal praise. His mantra in life had, after all, always been, just get on with it. Philip was as pragmatic about death as he was practical in life. His first instruction was that he would not die in hospital, but at Windsor Castle, his home. Further detailed instructions for his own funeral, known by the code name Operation Forth Bridge, were to be carried out to the letter and were incontestable. He ruled that there would be no state service at Westminster Abbey, even though, as the Queen's husband, he was entitled to one, nor would his body lie in state. Instead, Prince Philip settled on having a ceremonial military funeral at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the high medieval Gothic-style Royal Peculiar, and the Chapel of the Order of the Garter, located in the lower ward of the castle, built in 1475. In addition, the Duke instructed that a palace official should not confirm or deny anything about his death until the designated footman, dressed in full livery, had attached the framed notice to the gates of Buckingham Palace. Then, and only then, would the royal family's team of communications officers at the palace press office be allowed to break the silence. Everyone with a role in this final piece of solemn theatre knew exactly what to do and when, so that it could be carried out, as Philip planned, with the minimum of fuss. When the COVID-19 pandemic first struck in March 2020, and both he and the Queen were forced to relocate and self-isolate at Windsor, he agreed to simplify the funeral arrangements still further, should anything happen to him. He never liked loose ends. Robust and controversial, Prince Philip inevitably had detractors. They preferred to focus on his so-called gaffes, perceived blunders and crotchety remarks, rather than his huge achievements. He deserves his place in history on merit. Reducing Philip to a caricature of himself is a gross misrepresentation of one of life's great characters, leaders, and innovators, and does him a disservice. He often uttered his risque comments simply to liven up dull proceedings, and at boring official events he often drew a laugh by saying, "You're going to see the world's most experienced plaque unveiler at work." He once got a roar of laughter from the crowd on a visit to Canada in 1969. "I declare this thing open," whatever it is. He would tell advisers that when he entered a room, he would look along a line and select one person he would try to make laugh. I was fortunate to have met the Duke of Edinburgh many times in my capacity as a royal correspondent and author, both in public and private. He was president of my London club, the Naval and Military Club, known as the In and Out Club, at 4 St. James's Square. Indeed, naval history remained a keen interest throughout his life. He was appointed a trustee of the National Maritime Museum in 1948. He was instrumental in saving the tea clipper Cutty Sark, now a museum ship stationed in Greenwich, and in establishing the Maritime Trust. He was funny, sometimes audacious and sharp-witted on each occasion. He didn't care about offending the politically correct brigade and spent even less time on any criticism they may have thrown his way. As for the ladies and gentlemen of the press, he had even less time, and despite having a number of friends who were journalists in his earlier years, took to referring to them as the reptiles. In 1983, in Bangladesh, the Queen and the Duke were standing in the garden of a government building to meet guests waiting in line for a cocktail party. Ashley Walton, the then royal correspondent of the Daily Express, was with other members of the travelling royal rat pack of reporters at the end of the line. Philip, not realising he could be overheard, turned to the Queen and grimaced, "Here come the bloody reptiles." When asked if he felt the press has been unfair to him or misrepresented him, he said, "I suppose yes, occasionally, but I think it has its own agenda, and that's it. You just have to live with it." He saw journalists as fair game, as they saw the royals in a similar light. Whenever he came into direct contact with one, he would toy with his prey, but just like a cat with a mouse, he was not actually playing. When he was guest of honour at the 60th birthday dinner of the Foreign Press Association in London in 1948, he described journalists as the people's ambassadors, but then added caustically, "I often wish the people didn't want to know quite so much." The Parliamentary Press Gallery invited him as its guest of honour in 1956 and asked for his views on journalists in general. "It is very tempting," said the Duke, "but I think I had better wait until I get a bit older." Indeed, he had been making jokes at the expense of the press for years. Looking at the Barbary apes on a visit to the Rock of Gibraltar in 1950, accompanied by a posse of press, he joked, "Which are the apes and which are the reporters?" Even senior journalists who had been invited to his home were not safe. I remember at a media reception held at Windsor Castle in 2002 to mark the Queen's Golden Jubilee, which I attended, he was on top form. "Who are you?" he demanded of Simon Kellner. "I'm the editor-in-chief of the Independent, sir." "What are you doing here?" asked the Duke. "You invited me." "Well, you didn't have to come." His next victim was Martin Townsend, the bespectacled and affable then editor of the Sunday Express. "Ah, the Sunday Express," said Philip. "I was very fond of Arthur Christensen." "Yes, there's been a long line of distinguished editors," replied Townsend. "I didn't say that," Philip replied bluntly before walking away. At the same reception, I was chatting to two distinguished Irish journalists as the royals worked the room. Out of nowhere, the Duke appeared. He peered at the labels on our lapels, and as soon as he had worked out that they were Irishmen, he then proceeded to tell a completely inappropriate Irish joke. "Did you hear the one about the Irish pilot who radioed the air traffic control tower saying he had a problem?" They clearly had heard it, but played along politely. "Tower control then cleared him to land," Philip said, "but also asked for his height and position." "Well, I'm 5'8", and I'm sitting in the cockpit at the front of the plane," said the Duke, and delighted at being the first to laugh at the punchline of his own joke. We all dutifully joined in. Then he read my name badge, which said, "Robert Jobson, Royal Correspondent, The Sun." He also recognised my naval and military club tie, and just tutted, saying, "They'll let anyone in these days," and walked off to find his next victim with the enthusiasm of a naughty schoolboy. But there was another side to the Duke, rarely seen, even when it came to interacting with media. His staff loved him too. Whenever he hosted a party for his team, he made sure everyone who had supported him and his work was invited, from the cleaners to his private secretary. He always commanded fierce loyalty. He was often unpleasant and impatient when dealing with photographers, He let fly with the F word at an unfortunate photographer during a photo call that he deemed to be taking too long at an event to mark the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain on the 19th of July 2015. His temper exploded as the official photographer dithered. "Just take the fucking picture!" At the Windsor horse trials, he agreed to allow a woman member of the public to take a picture of her daughter and him together as he was about to leave. However, when the camera failed for the third time, he let out his familiar expletive and drove off, much to the little girl's surprise. Despite his reputation, he wasn't always so rude to photographers and reporters, and on rare occasions he could be generous and accommodating. Once, Sun photographer Mark Sweeney, later the newspaper's Scottish picture editor, was sent to scout Balmoral with a colleague, and they were getting nowhere. His friend had just taken delivery of a gleaming new BMW, and they decided to abandon the Royal Watch and drive 5 miles south of Braemar to Loch Mick to take some shots of the car with a classic Scottish background. After a few minutes, a Range Rover Vogue SE pulled up, towing a fishing boat, with Philip at the wheel. He was alone. "Are you guys off duty?" Philip asked, mistaking the two photographers for policemen. "Could you help me launch the boat into the loch?" Mark agreed and made sure the Duke was aware that they were Sun photographers, which didn't faze him. They proceeded to help him get the small fishing boat into the water. Without the photographers asking, Philip said, "I should get some fish in a while. Do you want to get some shots of my pulling them out of the water?" The pair, both unassuming in their approach, were delighted, and sent the excellent and exclusive shots to the picture desks in Glasgow and London, who were thrilled. Most importantly, he was the Queen's most loyal and trusted supporter, somebody she could rely on completely to help her through the longest reign in British history. At this time of mourning and reflection, it is right to remember and respect his dedicated service to his wife Queen Elizabeth, his country, and the institution of monarchy. A tireless supporter of charity, industry, the arts, and education, he was founder, fellow, patron, president, chairman, and member of more than 800 organizations. He was also the head of his family. By the time of his death, he was a father of 4, grandfather of 8, and great-grandfather of another 10. For decades, Philip shared the Queen's burden of office without upstaging her, always privately providing reassurance and advice, but never overstepping the boundaries of his supporting role. It was an unforgiving position, a challenge for anyone, but one that he met head-on. He remained the Queen's advisor all her adult life and into his retirement, and was instantly recognized the world over. That said, he was wise enough to acknowledge his limitations and the constraints that came with his public role. He always seemed to instinctively know when it was time to step back and let his wife take the lead. His job, after all, was always to allow her star to shine. In his 90th birthday interview, he told the BBC that he had to work out what his role would be for himself, by trial and error. "There was no precedent. If I asked somebody, 'What do you expect me to do?' they all looked blank. They had no idea. Nobody had much idea," he said in a typically forthright manner. Philip was very reluctant to talk about himself and his achievements, too, to BBC broadcaster Fiona Bruce, refusing to say what he was most proud of. "I couldn't care less," he said gruffly when asked if he thought he had been successful in his role. "Who cares what I think about it? I mean, it's ridiculous." I'm sure Philip did consider his legacy. He did, after all, achieve a great deal in his life, both as a role model and leader. He inspired young people to be the best they could be, to develop strength of character through action and experience, and gave them a platform to help them achieve it. Perhaps his most far-reaching initiative was his eponymous the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which has stretched the capabilities of millions of young people globally. Drawing on his experiences at Gordonston and at the suggestion of his old headmaster, Kurt Hahn, he established the award in 1956. He appointed Brigadier Sir John Hunt, leader of the British expedition that had scaled Everest 3 years earlier, as the scheme's first director. The activity program was born out of Philip's belief that the young should be given opportunities to learn and wanted to introduce young people to new experiences, including physical, skills-based, and community challenges. "I don't run it. I've said it's all fairly second-hand, the whole business. I mean, I eventually got landed with the responsibility or the credit for it," he said when pressed about it. "I've got no reason to be proud of it. It's satisfying that we've set up a formula that works, that's it," he finally said grudgingly to Fiona Bruce. She seemed a little taken aback by the irascible Duke, but she soon recovered her composure. Philip, never one for saying sorry, loved putting interviewers on the back foot and testing resolve. When the at first bullish interviewer Alan Titmarsh interviewed Philip for ITV's Philip at 90, the unfortunate television personality didn't fare much better. "You were thrust into combat at a very early age," he remarked, before the Duke barked back. "So was lots of other people." "Was fatherhood a role you were conscious of fulfilling?" "No, I was just a father," came Philip's blunt response. "It has been a unique position," Titmarsh offered up limply. Which Philip batted back. "There have been several others, Prince Albert, Prince George." "Were you trying to make a difference?" "I was asked to do it," Philip replied with a deep sigh. "You've been voted Oldie of the Year," Titmarsh added, his optimism draining from his voice, but this time hopeful of a lighter response. "So what?" Philip responded irritably. "You just get old." Philip had actually been touched at getting that title from the Oldie publication. In a self-effacing letter to the organisers of an awards ceremony to celebrate the achievements of the elderly, the Duke admitted that time was passing ever more quickly as he prepared to enter his 10th decade with the inevitable effect on his morale. In accepting the award, Philip showed he hadn't allowed physical frailty to affect his sense of humour. He apologised for not being able to appear in person at Simpson's in the Strand to collect it, and added, "I much appreciate your invitation to receive an Oldie of the Year award. There is nothing like it for morale to be reminded that the years are passing ever more quickly and that bits are beginning to drop off the ancient frame. But it is nice to be remembered at all." Prince Philip was much more, however, than a sharp-witted raconteur who would walk 2 steps behind his wife when carrying out public engagements. He was his wife's liege man, dedicated to the crown and a resolute public servant. He was the Queen's rock throughout her long reign, and his death will be devastating to her. For someone who has always kept her feelings a closely guarded secret, it is impossible to know the true depth of impact the loss of her husband will have upon the Queen. She will, of course, be comforted by her faith, but there is no doubt that she truly loved Philip. On the 20th of November 1997, after 50 years of marriage, her love and devotion were incontrovertible as she marked their golden wedding anniversary at Banqueting House, Whitehall. She let her guard down for a moment and gave a remarkably personal and heartfelt tribute to her husband. "All too often, I fear, Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner." Queen Elizabeth told the audience that included the then British Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Tony Blair. "He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know." Elizabeth and Philip's marriage was not a dynastic arrangement to cement a treaty or an alliance with a foreign power as in days gone by. It was a true love match, built on foundations of romance and loyalty. Philip, who presented the Queen with an engraved E&P diamond and ruby bracelet to mark their 5th anniversary, romanced his wife throughout their long lives with love tokens and personal trinkets. At times, like any husband, he infuriated her, but they shared a similar sense of humour, and those close to the couple said he always managed to make her laugh. Her Majesty's life with Philip was never dull. As their beloved daughter-in-law Sophie, Countess of Wessex, wife of their 4th child, Prince Edward, and a close confidant of the Queen, said when she gave a rare glimpse into the dynamic of the relationship, "For her to have found somebody like him, I don't think she could have chosen better. And they make each other laugh, which is half the battle, isn't it?" Whenever possible, Elizabeth and Philip made time to take afternoon tea together when they were in residence at the same time, and would talk over their experiences of the day. Philip lived almost full-time at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk after he retired, and while Her Majesty continued with her official duties, such intimacy was less frequent. But when Philip informed his wife, 5 years Philip's junior, that he wanted to effectively step down from royal duties, she rightly felt he had earned his rest after nearly 70 years of public service as a working member of the royal family. The COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020 changed this. Forced to shield together in Windsor Castle in isolation from the rest of the royal family, Philip and the Queen spent more time together than ever, and it brought the couple as close as any time in their 72-year marriage. Having Philip at her side again and being able to spend quality time with her husband appeared to give her a new lease of life, those close to her said. They were cared for by a small team of loyal staff who were dubbed HMS Bubble. They were able to relax and finally live relatively normal lives, as people in their 90s perhaps should be able to. They decamped to Balmoral, Aberdeenshire, the Queen's privately owned Scottish estate, for their summer break, but cut short their trip after 6 weeks as they found it a little tedious with all the social distancing rules and restrictions due to coronavirus. They spent a further 2 weeks on her Norfolk estate, Sandringham, before she returned to Windsor, with Philip remaining on Wood Farm, his usual residence after retiring. In early November 2020, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh reunited at Windsor Castle for the second national lockdown, where they spent a quiet Christmas without their family, again due to the coronavirus. It was the first time in 32 years that the couple had not been at Sandringham, normally marked by a procession of royals walking from the big house to nearby St. Mary Magdalene Church to attend the morning service, watched by members of the public for the festive period. The Queen also announced that she would not attend a Christmas Day service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, to avoid attracting crowds. The palace said the couple hoped things would get back to normal in 2021. Sadly, that was not to be the case. Without Philip at the head of the table, how could it be? Philip was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital in London on the 17th of February 2021 as a precautionary measure on the advice of a palace doctor. After being taken to the private hospital by car, he walked in unaided. It was not an emergency admission or COVID-related, but it was a warning. Sadly, it came on the day that his retired page, Christopher Harry Marlowe, who had been honoured with a bar to his Royal Victorian Medal, Silver, by the Queen upon his retirement in 2003, had died. The Duke had been feeling unwell for a short period, and the doctor was called, and the phrase that was used by his doctors was an abundance of caution. Boris Johnson led the nation in sending his best wishes to the Duke for a speedy recovery, and wished him well while he rested in hospital. The Prince of Wales made a 100-mile trip to visit the Duke of Edinburgh in hospital 3 days later, and spent half an hour at his bedside, leaving shortly before 4 p.m. Observers described him as looking sombre as he climbed into his car. During the time they spent together at the castle in lockdown, Elizabeth and Philip were able to rediscover some of the happiness of their earlier years, and this will surely give Her Majesty memories to cherish and strength in her time of need and mourning. Chapter 2. Nomadic Prince. "I didn't know any different. You just get on with it," Prince Philip when asked about his upbringing. The Queen and Prince Philip's marriage is seen as the bedrock of our modern monarchy. For 75 years he was her rock, somebody she could rely on without question. So it seems hard to imagine now that there were many leading figures, including her father, the king, who were against the union. It meant their journey to the altar of Westminster Abbey to pronounce the marital vows was far from smooth. Elizabeth, headstrong and determined despite her comparative youth, had to fight for what she wanted, and what she wanted, without question, was Philip. Philip, as a young man, was seen by some in the British establishment as an outsider and a threat. Born Prince Philippos of Greece and Denmark, the man destined to wed the most eligible woman in the world and be elevated to HRH Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was born on a kitchen table at his family's villa Maurepas, south of Corfu City on the Greek isle of Corfu, on the 10th of June, 1921. Philip may have had the bloodline, connections, and good looks to marry well, but events meant he didn't have the fortune to match. His mother, a great-granddaughter of the last monarch of the Hanoverian dynasty, Queen Empress Victoria, was Princess Alice of Battenberg. Born congenitally deaf, she was a Hessian princess by birth, as the Battenberg family was a morganatic branch of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt. The first member of the House of Battenberg was Julia Hawke, whose brother-in-law, Grand Duke Louis III of Hesse, created her Countess of Battenberg with the style Illustrious Highness in 1851, on her morganatic marriage to Grand Duke Louis's brother, Prince Alexander of Hesse and by Rhine. Julia was elevated in her title to Princess of Battenberg with the style Serene Highness, HSH, in 1858. Two of the sons of Alexander and Julia, Prince Henry of Battenberg and Prince Louis of Battenberg, became associated with the British royal family. Prince Henry married Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. Prince Louis married Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, and became the first Sea Lord of the British Royal Navy. Due to understandable anti-German feelings in Britain during the great 1914-1918 war, not even the King, George V, and the royal family and their close relations were safe from criticism. Author H.G. Wells confirmed King George's worst fears in his Times newspaper column in which he referred to Britain's alien and uninspiring court. George V, who thought Wells to be impertinent, famously responded, "I may be uninspiring, but I'll be damned if I'm an alien." Lord Stamfordham, George V's private secretary, in cahoots with Prime Minister David Lloyd George, felt the king needed to distance himself from his blatant German ancestry, given the wave of anti-German feeling sweeping the country at the time. On the 17th of July 1917, the Privy Council proclaimed, "Henceforth the royal family would be called the House of Windsor, having divested itself of its previous surname, as well as all other German degrees, styles, titles, dignitaries, honours, and appellations." After a number of alternatives were considered, including Plantagenet, York, England, Lancaster, D'Este, and Fitzroy, Lord Stamfordham's suggestion of Windsor was adopted, after a minor title once held by Edward III. His cousin, the Kaiser, himself a grandson of Queen Victoria, saw the funny side, and remarked he looked forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. A more serious and altogether grander disapproval came from the Bavarian Count Albrecht von Montgelas, who commented that the true royal tradition died on that day in 1917, when, for a mere war, King George V changed his name. It was not just the immediate family, but all branches of the family that were impacted. The Tech family became the Cambridges and took the earldom of Athlone. The Battenbergs, Philip's mother's family, overnight were transformed into the Mountbattens, with the Marquisate of Milford Haven. Prince Louis, his children and his nephews, the living sons of Prince Henry, were effectively forced to renounce their German titles and change their name to the more English-sounding Mountbatten. They rejected an alternative translation, Batten Hill. Their cousin George V compensated the princes with British peerages. Louis became the first Marquis of Milford Haven, while Prince Alexander, Prince Henry's eldest son, became the first Marquis of Carisbrooke. He was offered a dukedom by the king, but declined as he could not afford the lavish lifestyle expected of a duke. As for George, who had always been quintessentially British and found German a rotten language, he felt the move was timely and necessary, given the hostility to royal houses across Europe which had led to their collapse, and it received a positive reaction in the press. It proved a wise move, as one of the most important roles of the Windsor monarchs was to act as national figureheads during the two devastating wars of 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 1945, ostensibly against Germany. Although Prince Philip's uncle on his father's side was King Constantine I of Greece, he did not have a drop of Greek blood, as he was descended from Danish, German, and British royalty. Philip's father was the son of King George I of Greece, a former Danish prince installed as the Greek monarch in 1863 and later assassinated in 1913. Andrea was a major general in the Greek army and had already left to take up his command the day before his son's birth, and did not see him for months. Philip's mother wrote to inform her husband of the splendid, healthy child who at birth was sixth in line to the Greek throne. But this was an insecure royal house, one that could be toppled by its volatile people at any given moment. Philip was born into dangerous times. Greece was again involved in a bloody war with old enemy and neighbour Turkey, Asia Minor at the time, and when the military campaign led by the Greek king proved an unmitigated disaster, the people and politicians looked to their royal family as scapegoats. After the humiliating defeat was confirmed, discontent spread among the middle-ranking officers and men, and it boiled over into a full-scale armed revolt led by anti-royalist senior officers. The destruction of the Greek forces in Anatolia led to calls for those responsible for the shambles to be punished. The government of Petros Protopapadakis resigned on the 28th of August, and the new government, headed by Niklaus Triantafylakos, replaced it. Within days, on the 11th of September, the revolution was declared, with the formation of a revolutionary committee headed by Colonels Niklaus Plastiras as representative of the army in Chios, and Stylianos Goneidas as representative of the army in Lesvos, and Commander Dimitros in Phokas as representative of the navy. The next day the troops boarded their ships and headed to Athens. Before they arrived there, a military aeroplane delivered a manifesto demanding the resignation of King Constantine I, the dissolution of Parliament, and the formation of a new politically independent government. On the 13th of September, King Constantine resigned and went into exile in Italy. His son, George II, was declared king. On the 15th of September, the troops of revolution entered the city of Athens and blocked the efforts Theodoros Pengalos was making to take advantage of the situation and take control of the government. Soon a new government was formed with Sotiros Krokidas as chairman. With the king forced to leave his country, angry mobs demanded a scapegoat, and Philip's unfortunate father, Andrea, fitted the bill. He was arrested and charged with poor leadership and disobeying a direct order. He was warned by a member of the newly installed government that his son and 4 daughters would soon be orphans. a date was set for his court-martial in Athens. Philip's older sister, Princess Sophie of Greece and Denmark, noted the family's trauma in her private memoir. "My father's trial ended with him being sentenced to death. Many governments tried to save his life, including King Alfonso XIII of Spain and the Pope. But finally, my father's first cousin, Britain's George V, succeeded in having the death sentence remitted. He may have been spared his life by the intervention of his powerful extended family, but Andrea felt he had been stripped of his honour. What followed was difficult for the proud prince to live with, the humiliating prospect of a perpetual exile from his country. Indeed, thanks to George V, the family was spirited to safety in the battleship cruiser HMS Calypso. Unsurprisingly, it was a chaotic and dangerous time for the whole family, and they didn't have enough time to make sure Philip had a proper cot or carriage to carry him in. They had to think quickly to work out a way to transport the infant Philip, so the family got creative and carried him aboard in an orange crate. It might not have been the most comfortable means of travel for Philip, but it managed to help him and his family successfully flee to safety. With little money and no papers, the royal refugees sailed to Britain dreaming of a calmer existence. But if they thought they would be welcome there, due to George's intervention, they were soon to be disappointed. It was only 5 years after the Russian Revolution when another of George V's cousins, Russian Emperor Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, had been shot and bayoneted to death by communist revolutionaries in Yekaterinburg. European royalty was on the run with the rise of socialism, and the king did not welcome the idea of having exiled royals on display in England, reminding his subjects that royalty and monarchy was not permanent and could be overthrown. The prospect of living in London among a rather hostile people didn't appeal to Andrea and his family either, so instead he decided to take his family to Paris, where he was lent a suite of rooms in a palais on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne. There was always a sense of impermanence for Andrea and his family. The exiled prince soon realized he didn't have the capital to pay for the household that came with the accommodation, so they moved across the Seine to a lodge in the garden of the impressive mansion 5 Rue du Mont Valérien, situated in the hilltop suburb of Saint-Cloud, a few miles west from the centre of Paris. The property, surrounded by apple trees, belonged to the heiress wife of Andrea's elder brother, Prince George of Greece and Denmark, known to the family as Big George. Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was a great-grandniece of Emperor Napoleon I of France, had inherited her huge wealth from her maternal grandfather, François Blanc, the principal real estate developer of Monte Carlo. She was destined to be a disciple and benefactor of Sigmund Freud, and thus central to the establishment of psychoanalysis and sexology in France. The dramatic escape and fall from power took its toll on Philip's parents, leaving them scarred mentally. They were broke, too. Although Marie was a gracious and generous hostess who did her best to support her husband's brother and his family and small staff, Andrea's finances were a mess. He had managed to bring some money with him during the hurried exit from Greece and had a bequest from Constantine, his brother, as well as an annuity from his late father, but it was not enough to sustain him and his family. He had inherited Villa Montrepos, but feared his property in Greece would be confiscated by the revolutionary government. To his surprise, it was not, and in 1926 he secured a deal to lease it to his wife's wealthy brother, Lord Louis Dickey Mountbatten. That provided another modest source of much-needed cash. He eventually sold Montrepos to his nephew, King George II of Greece, in 1937, having won a legal case legitimizing his ownership. Philip's mother, who had inherited a tenth of the estate of her father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, suffered terribly from the family's enforced refugee status. Her inheritance had been radically reduced due to the war and the Russian Revolution. Philip, sensitive to his surroundings and his family's plight, appreciated that there was a need to economize and to value what he had, so much so that he acquired a reputation of being mean. Philip, however, recalled his childhood as a happy time. His resilient family had learned to always make the best of their situation. Supported by his uncle Christopher, in 1927 Philip, aged 6, was enrolled at an American school known as the Elms. He settled in quickly, insisting on being called just Philip, dumping the princely title when he was asked to introduce himself, as he wisely was reluctant to stand out by letting the other boys know of his high birth. Princess Alice encouraged the headmaster, Donald McJanet, known to the boys as Mr. Mac, to establish a Cub Scout group so that her son's great vitality was put to good use. Another key figure of constancy in the young Philip's life was the family nanny, Emily Roos, a down-to-earth Englishwoman who instilled a sense of the importance of the English language and values in him. Philip enjoyed his first school and the challenges it threw up. "I had 4 sisters, and we were living in quite a small house just outside Paris, and I went to an American children's school. I was French and English-speaking because I had an English nanny and the family spoke about 4 languages, so one got a bit confused," he recalled. "Often a conversation would start in English, then somebody couldn't remember the word, so it went on in French, then it went into Greek, and then into German, and this would happen all the time," he added. Another time, he recalled, "If anything, I've thought of myself as Scandinavian, particularly Danish. We spoke English at home." His cousin, the late Countess Mountbatten of Burma, said she couldn't recall the first time she met her cousin Philip. "He was boisterous and full of fun, and got up to all sorts of things you hadn't dared get up to yourself." Constantine II of Greece said Philip had a unique ability to make the person he was talking to feel the most important person in the room. Lady Myra Butter, another cousin, described him as very boyish, but great fun and very kind. He hasn't really changed as a person at all. Exile took its toll on Philip's mother, who began to suffer a rapid deterioration of her mental state. Her marriage to Andrea was in crisis too. His mother's ill health would always be something Philip played down throughout his life, but it undoubtedly had a huge impact on him. Dismissed as a religious crisis, her family tried to cover up her mental frailty. For Andrea, his wife's heightened state of mania and her religious fervour became impossible to cope with. She became obsessed with spiritualism and the supernatural too, repeatedly dealing her cards to predict her future path and obtain messages. Alice also became obsessed with a mystery Englishman in 1925 with whom she fell hopelessly in love, but she repressed her feelings for him. Another suggestion is that Alice was suffering from manic depression, or bipolar disorder, as it would later be known, a mental condition that can lead to dramatic mood swings and periods of prolonged manic energy. In October 1928, just 2 weeks after she and her husband marked their 25th wedding anniversary at Saint-Cloud, Alice converted to the Greek Orthodox faith. But the following year, her mental state deteriorated and her behaviour became even more odd. She took to lying on the floor in a bid to converse with God, and became convinced she had been given a divine power to heal. By November, the situation had reached crisis point. When her mother, Princess Victoria, went to Paris for a visit in January 1929, there was serious concern for Alice. The family turned to Marie Bonaparte for advice, as she had recently undergone psychoanalysis with Sigmund Freud. Marie recommended that her sister-in-law go to a clinic run by Freudian Dr. Ernest Simmel outside Berlin in Tegel, the first to use psychoanalysis to treat patients. Alice was diagnosed by Simmel as a paranoid schizophrenic, and he also claimed she was suffering from a neurotic, pre-psychotic libidinous condition. On the 2nd of May 1930, Victoria contacted Professor Wilmans and agreed to section Alice at his psychiatric clinic, Bellevue Sanatorium at Kreuzlingen on Lake Constance. When he arrived at 5 Rue du Mont Valérien, Alice was alone, as it had been arranged for her children to be out. She needed to be sedated before being bundled into a car and driven away without the opportunity to say goodbye to her son and daughters. Philip had been taken for a walk, and when he came back, his mother had gone. Believing that her reported visions were the results of sexual frustration, it was recommended she receive therapy involving electroshock treatment. Alice pleaded her sanity, but was kept in the sanatorium for over 2 years. Philip had to learn to take whatever life threw at him. He would not see his mother for the rest of his childhood. His father, Andrea, moved in with his mistress and effectively abandoned his young son, now his daughters were married. He headed south to Monte Carlo for pastures new. It was the beginning of Philip's nomadic existence. At just 9 years old, with his mother in a psychiatric clinic and his father mostly absent, Philip had to learn to face the world alone. "I just had to get on with it. You do. One does," Philip said when reflecting on his childhood. "I didn't notice it at the time, no. It seemed to be perfectly normal as far as I was concerned. How could I compare it to anything else?" It was a fair point, but it could have left many boys of his own age emotionally damaged. Alice's brother, George Mountbatten, 2nd Marquess of Milford Haven, effectively became Philip's guardian. George and his wife, Nada, the flamboyant and sexually fluid great-granddaughter of the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, and the daughter of Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich, sent for him to join them at their home Linden Manor, England, for the next stage of the young Philip's life's journey. Within weeks, he joined Cheam School, Surrey, then Britain's oldest preparatory school, as a boarder. The athletic Philip delighted his uncle by excelling on the sports field, winning a clutch of trophies and being selected to join the cricket first 11. The school afforded him stability, as his family network practically disappeared. By the end of 1931, his 4 older sisters had all married members of the German nobility, and from the summer of 1932 to 1937, Philip did not hear from his mother. Meanwhile, his father Andrea, who by now had closed down the family home at Saint-Cloud, moved to Monte Carlo full-time with his mistress, French film actress and wealthy widow André Lafayette, also known as André de la Bine, aboard a yacht David. Philip attended all his sisters' weddings in Germany. He briefly joined his brother-in-law's school at Salem, despite the fact that it was being taken over with Nazi doctrine as Hitler's power and influence rose in Germany. The school's co-founder, Dr. Kurt Hahn, had already fled the country, amid the rise of the Nazi Party and sustained persecution of the Jewish population by the brown-shirt SA, or Sturmtruppen, led by Hitler's brutal henchman Ernst Röhm. In enforced exile, the Jewish intellectual went on to found an outward-bound boarding school in Duffus, to the northwest of Elgin, Scotland. "I went to Salem. It seemed to be the sensible thing to go because it was owned by my brother-in-law, so it was the cheapest way of educating me," Philip recalled. "After I'd been at Salem for about a year, the Nazis had more or less taken over, and life was getting a bit tricky, because my brother-in-law and sister were not really enthusiastic about the Nazis and didn't think it was very good for me to be there." Dr. Hahn later recalled Philip's irreverence to the Nazis. Whenever the Nazi salute was given, he roared with laughter. This was apparently because his pals at Cheam used to make a similar gesture when they wanted to go to the lavatory. The year 1934 saw Hitler's infamous Night of the Long Knives on the 30th of June, when the Nazi leader, fearing that the paramilitary SA had become too powerful, ordered a purge and sent his elite SS guards to murder Röhm. With political turmoil in Germany increasing, Philip returned to Britain. "We thought it better for him," explained his sister Theodora. Eventually, after consulting his father, it was decided that Philip would be sent to Kurt Hahn's new school, Gordonston, on the Morayshire coast, close to Elgin and Lossiemouth in Scotland, where he had developed a testing Spartan regime for his pupils. A visionary educationalist, Dr. Hahn believed that young people flourish when their horizons are broadened beyond just their academic potential. Despite his rank, Philip never asked for any privilege on account of his birth. Years later, in 1961, Dr. Hahn gave an interview and said, "One thing you can definitely say is that early on he was one of those boys who very early on rendered disinterested service and who never asked for any privilege on account of his birth." On his return to Britain, Philip flourished, excelling academically, demonstrating what his masters described as a lively intelligence and a determination to exert himself more than was necessary. His chief faults were his intolerance and impatience, they said, but although often naughty, he was never nasty. His sporting prowess reached new heights, too, when he became both captain of the hockey and cricket teams, culminating in him later acting as head boy. The robust system at Gordonston suited Philip. The boys were up at 6:30 a.m. for a cold shower and a run. From 10:30 a.m. they had a break from lessons for sporting activities. After lunch, adult boys would read to the younger ones. At this time, the most stable influence on Philip was his grandmother, Princess Victoria, Marchioness of Milford Haven, an amazingly strong and intelligent woman. She could be a little overbearing, but she kept a watchful eye on him, ensuring he had his school uniform and making timely visits to Scotland so he didn't feel isolated and alone. I admired her enormously. She was hugely intelligent and well-read and had fascinating conversation. She knew about everything as far as I was concerned, he said of her. The school and Philip were a perfect fit. His time there taught him self-reliance with the motto, "Plus est en vous un," there is more in you. Competing at your best level to achieve something for yourself was its ethos. It was to stay with Philip all his life. At 16, Philip was hit by tragedy. That November, his pregnant and beloved eldest sister Cecily died in a plane crash after setting off from Frankfurt Aerodrome in a 3-engine Junkers monoplane operated by the Belgian airline Sabena to London Airport for a family wedding. Cecily was travelling with her husband, George Donatus, known as Don, who had just succeeded his father as the Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, his widowed mother, the Dowager Grand Duchess, and the couple's 2 young sons, Prince Ludwig, 6, and Prince Alexander, 4. Their baby sister, Princess Johanna, was deemed too young to attend the wedding and didn't travel. The plane, flown by experienced Captain Tony Lambot, a personal friend and pilot of Belgian King Leopold III, was due to touch down en route near Brussels, but thick fog forced the pilot to fly to Steen Aerodrome near Ostend. Fog had swept in there too, and it meant the pilot was flying blind. 3 rockets were fired to help him find his way, but only the first one worked. During the descent, tragedy struck as the plane hit the top of a brickworks chimney at around 100 miles per hour, and then crashed into the roof, killing all on board. When firemen sifted through the burnt wreckage, they found the remains of a baby lying next to the body of Cecily, which gave rise to the theory that the pilot had tried to land as the Grand Duchess was giving birth. It was left to his headmaster, Dr. Hahn, to break the devastating news to Philip. He recalled that Philip's sorrow was that of a man. He kept a piece of wood recovered from the wreckage for the rest of his life. Philip's cousin, Lady Myra Butter, recalled, "That was totally horrendous. Somehow he has had to bear with that one. He just gets on with it. That's his motto. Just get on with it. Sometimes, what are the alternatives?" Alice reunited with her family at the funeral in Germany. It was the first time the teenager had seen his mother in almost 5 years. But she did not stay long in his life and went on to found a nunnery in Greece, funded with her own jewels, and was never seen in civilian clothes after 1949. Philip suffered another blow the next April when George Mountbatten, his mentor and benefactor, died from cancer at just 45. His care now fell to his other maternal uncle, Louis Dickey Mountbatten. Mountbatten's daughter, the late Patricia Countess Mountbatten, recalled Philip as a vibrant youngster who was a regular guest at their home. "He was 3 years older than me. He was very boyish, full of fun, loved to play pranks, quite nice pranks, and just somebody that one welcomed rather than think, 'Oh, it's a bit of a bore, so-and-so is coming,' the Countess said. It was, 'How nice he's going to come and enliven life.'" In 1935, for a brief moment, Philip was torn between his influential English relatives and his role as a Prince of Greece. That year, Georgios Kondylis, a former military officer, became the most powerful political figure in Greece. On the 10th of October, he compelled Panagis Saldaris to resign as Greek Prime Minister and took over the government himself, suspending many constitutional provisions in the process. Kondylis, who had joined the Conservatives, decided to hold a referendum in order to restore the monarchy in Greece. It took place on the 3rd of November 1935, and incredibly, the proposal was approved by 97.9% of voters. Philip's first cousin, a maternal nephew of Wilhelm II, the last German emperor, George II of Greece, who had reigned as King of Greece from 1922 to 1924, returned to Athens after 12 years of exile, the latter part of which had been spent living at Brown's Hotel in London. The crown was formally restored on the 30th of November 1935. The move meant that Philip was now sixth in line to the Greek throne, and it gave his father Andrea, who was living in Monte Carlo, a renewed purpose. He said in one newspaper interview, "We shall not return as avengers, but as symbols of the love of the people on whose will alone the restoration will be founded." The body of Philip's uncle Constantine I was duly returned to Athens for burial, and Philip, in mourning coat, attended the ceremony. His future journey was at a crossroads. The new King of Greece wanted his cousin Philip to join the Greek navy, but Dickey Mountbatten persuaded him otherwise. He had come to see Greece as an undeveloped, backward Balkan country inhabited by a romantic but volatile and feral people. Dickey advised Philip that Greece was not a stable enough country to nail his colours to, and was determined to steer his nephew and protégé towards a career in the British Royal Navy. Britain's George V was equally unconvinced by the stability of the newly restored Greek monarchy, and felt it would not last long either. He was advised confidentially by the British ambassador, Sir Sidney Waterlow, that the experiment of restoring the monarchy in Greece was almost certainly doomed to fail, and that the new king was ill-advised to insist on restoring his uncle, Andrea, and his brother Nicholas to their elevated positions back in Greece and out of exile. But the decree that banished Andrea was lifted in 1936, and by the autumn he was once again living in Athens, serving as the main aide-de-camp to his nephew, the new monarch. If Philip's head was turned by the pomp and perceived importance of being a prominent member of the Greek royal family, he didn't show it. His headmaster, Dr. Hahn, later recalled that when Philip returned to school, he seemed more determined than ever to sit the special entry examination for the Royal Navy. He made it clear, Hahn said later, that England was his home. It was, in terms of his life's journey, the most consequential decision he would ever make. Once a close confidant of King Edward VIII, Dickey Mountbatten had deftly switched his allegiance to the new king, George VI, after the shock of the 1936 abdication crisis. He had big plans for his nephew, and saw Philip as the perfect consort to the Princess Elizabeth, heir presumptive. His striking good looks, strength of character, and his regal-blooded ancestry more than qualified him for that role, in Mountbatten's view. "I toyed with the idea of going to the Royal Air Force, but my uncle persuaded me to try the Navy. and I had to sit the civil service exam to become a special entry cadet in Dartmouth in 1939, Philip later recalled. His father, Andrea, remained involved in Philip's education, but from a distance. He soon tired of life in Athens, and with World War II approaching, returned to living his playboy existence and only saw his son fleetingly in the years that followed. In 1944, Philip lost his father, who remained in Vichy France from the beginning of the war, whilst his son fought on the side of the British. They were unable to see or even correspond with one another. Andrea died in the Metropole Hotel Monte Carlo of heart failure and arterial sclerosis as the war was ending, and substantially in debt, owing £17,500, around £782,000 today. The playboy prince left his only son some trunks containing clothing, an ivory shaving brush, a solitary pair of cufflinks, and a signet ring that Philip would wear for the rest of his life. Philip's mother, Princess Alice, had made a satisfactory recovery by this time and had returned to Greece where, during the Nazi occupation of Athens in the war, she hid a Jewish family and saved them from certain death at the hands of the SS and Nazis. Evie Cohen later spoke about how her father, Alfred Heimaki Cohen, head of a prominent family with ties to Greek royalty, sought out Princess Alice as their only hope of refuge from the Nazis. At the beginning of 1943, it became obvious that the decisions against Jews to take them to concentration camps were starting to be obvious. My family had to go into hiding. If it hadn't been for her, I wouldn't be alive today to say all this. My parents would not have met, and so many other things. Evie revealed in the documentary Princess Alice, the Royals' Greatest Secret. She didn't even think for a minute. She just heard that there were people in danger, and she thought she could do something for them. The story of Princess Alice and my family is a beautiful one, and I hope it can be an example for young people today to continue to do good things in life and to be human. Many years later, Princess Alice was honoured for her courage. She was to spend the last 2 years of her life at Buckingham Palace with her son and his young family. As Nazi Germany's tanks rolled across Europe, beginning with the German annexation of Sudetenland in 1938 and continuing in March 1939 with the invasion of the Czech lands and the creation of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Philip left school and enrolled as a cadet at Dartmouth Naval College. Hitler's annexation of Czechoslovakia breached the written guarantee he had issued to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in Munich in 1938. Stating that he had no further territorial demands to make in Europe. Therefore, on the 31st of March 1939, Chamberlain issued a formal guarantee of Poland's borders and said that he expected Hitler to moderate his demands. Hitler was not deterred, and on the 3rd of April 1939, he ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September. Hitler was convinced that Chamberlain would not go to war to defend Poland, and that France would lack the will to act alone. Prince Philip, meanwhile, was ready to serve his adopted country. As soon as he graduated, he was determined to be assigned to a warship, do his duty, and fight against the Nazi tyranny. He didn't have to wait long to get his chance. Chapter 3. Brief Encounters. The first time I remember meeting Philip was at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, in July 1939, just before the war. We may have met before at the coronation or the Duchess of Kent's wedding, but I don't remember. I was 13 years of age, and he was 18, and a cadet, just due to leave. Princess Elizabeth's recollections about her romance with Philip. Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth's paths first crossed at the wedding of his first cousin, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, to Prince George, later the Duke of Kent. Elizabeth, the groom's niece, was an 8-year-old bridesmaid and was included in all the main photographs. 13-year-old Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was really a bit-part player and did not feature. The wedding on the 29th of November 1934 at Westminster Abbey was a grand affair on a rather dull day. Coming a decade after the last royal wedding, that of his brother, the Duke of York, and Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Princess Elizabeth's parents, it was the first royal nuptials to be broadcast on the radio too. Tens of thousands of people lined the route and gave the bride and groom a warm-hearted crescendo of cheers, the commentator said on the Movie-Tone news special as they rode in the glass carriage. Westminster Abbey accommodated 1,500 guests, including members of the extended British royal family, as well as the royal families of Denmark, Greece, and Yugoslavia. There were also members of the former reigning royal families of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and other lesser royals who had also lost their thrones after World War I. Among the guests was the American-born British shipbroker Ernest Simpson and his American wife Wallis, who would soon become a household name. The bride's gown was in white and silver silk brocade, designed by couturier Edward Molyneux and worked on by a team of seamstresses, including, at Marina's request, a number of Russian émigrés. The dress featured a sheath silhouette, a draped cowl neckline, trumpet sleeves, and a wide train. A tiara given to her as a wedding gift secured her tulle veil, which Princess Elizabeth and 10-year-old Lady Mary Cambridge carried. After the bride reached the altar, the hymn "Gracious Spirit, Holy Ghost" was sung. Upon return to Buckingham Palace, a Greek Orthodox wedding ceremony was held in the private chapel officiated by the Metropolitan Dr. Stranopoulos Germanos, head of the Greek Orthodox Church in England. The Prince of Wales caused a stir when he decided to smoke and lit his cigarette using one of the many candles alight inside. Until then, Princess Elizabeth of York's life story had been far more stable than her exotic foreign male cousin, Philip. Protected and secure, she had been raised, embraced by love and affection. She may not have been born to be monarch, but as third in line to the throne, Elizabeth was a star attraction as far as the press was concerned. Hot coffee and sandwiches were sent out to reporters waiting in a huddle in the dark outside the house. The weather had been foul for a week, and the pervading mood in London was one of gloom. Britain was in serious crisis, with the threat of a general strike uppermost in people's minds. Inside 17 Bruton Street, Mayfair, the scene was one of undiluted joy. For at 2:40 a.m. on the 21st of April 1926, Elizabeth, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York, came into the world. The Duchess had been in labour for several hours, and the surgeon, Sir Henry Stratton, took the decision to perform a caesarean section. Thankfully, everything went well. The baby girl stood third in line of succession to the throne, after her uncle, the Prince of Wales, and her father, the Duke of York. At the time, it wasn't expected that her father would become king, or that she would ever become queen. News of the birth was kept private for an hour or two to allow the king and queen to be told first. At 4 a.m., George V and Queen Mary were woken at Windsor Castle and given the happy news. That afternoon they drove to London to see the baby girl. "A little darling with a lovely complexion and pretty fair hair," the Queen later wrote in her diary. The following day the Duke of York wrote to his mother, "You don't know what a tremendous joy it is to Elizabeth and me to have our little girl. We always wanted a child to make our happiness complete, and now that it has at last happened, it seems so wonderful and strange." Despite their royal rank, they were attentive parents. On the 28th of October, 1926, Elizabeth wrote to her mother, Lady Strathmore, from Sandringham, Norfolk, "My darling mother, the baby is very well, and now spends the whole day taking her shoes off and sucking her toes. She is going to be very wicked, and she is very quick, I think." The little princess was christened in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace 8 months later by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Cosmo Gordon Lang, a complex character said to have a jangle of warring personalities. The gold lily-shaped font was brought from St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and the water for the baptism came from the River Jordan in Palestine. The royal child was named Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. Elizabeth, after her mother, while her 2 middle names were those of her paternal great-grandmother, Queen Alexandra, and paternal grandmother, Queen Mary. The King and Queen were among her godparents. Also present were Lady Elphinstone, the baby's aunt and godmother, Arthur, Duke of Connaught, great-great-uncle and godfather, the Countess and Earl of Strathmore, maternal grandparents. The Earl was also a godparent, and Princess Mary, Viscountess Lascelles, aunt and godmother. They appeared together in a group photograph by Herbert van Dyck, a second-generation court photographer with a studio in close proximity to the palace, taken at the palace on the 29th of May, 1926. In January, on the King's orders, the Yorks embarked on a 6-month tour of several colonies and dominions, including New Zealand and Australia, leaving their tiny baby in the care of the unflappable, no-nonsense nanny, Mrs. Clara Knight, affectionately known as Allah. The Duchess particularly dreaded the trip, as it meant being parted from her baby daughter for so long. Her diary recorded her misery. Thursday, 6th of January 1927. Up by 8:30. Feel very miserable at leaving the baby. I drank some champagne and tried not to weep. With her parents away, the little princess often brightened the afternoons of her grandparents George and Mary. George V, a stern father by all accounts to his own 5 children, was transformed into a soft and besotted grandfather for his little Lilibet, the nickname she later gave herself, as she could not pronounce Elizabeth properly. Elizabeth's early life was blissfully happy, spent in the top-floor nursery at 145 Piccadilly, the London house taken by her parents on their return from their overseas visit. The Intercontinental Hotel London Park Lane now stands proudly on the very site. Back then, Elizabeth would play ensconced with Allah and her assistant, Margaret Bobo MacDonald. The King adored Elizabeth and often asked for her to be brought to the palace so that they could play. When they were not together, he would telephone the nursery and then focus on the window with a pair of binoculars to see his beloved granddaughter waving back at him. When the King became seriously ill, requiring lung surgery to be carried out on 12th of December 1928, Elizabeth was taken to stay with him in Bognor, the seaside resort in West Sussex, to help make his convalescence bearable. He would later bestow the suffix Regis, which means of the King, on the town, as he had spent so much time there. At that time, Princess Elizabeth was not expected to become the monarch, given that her uncle David was still expected to marry a suitable bride and produce a legitimate heir. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer in Stanley Baldwin's government, observed something special about the child on their first encounter. Within the Churchill papers is his earliest recorded reference to Elizabeth in a letter to his wife Clementine. Churchill, then 53, imagines the destiny of the future sovereign during a stay at Balmoral Castle on the 25th of September 1928. There is no one here at all except the family, the household, and Queen and Elizabeth, aged 2. The last is a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant, he recalled. When Princess Elizabeth was 4 years old, the Duke and Duchess of York were offered a new house, Royal Lodge, situated within Windsor Great Park, as a retreat. Elizabeth's beloved Grandpa England, as she called the King, presented her with a Shetland pony that ignited Elizabeth's lifelong love for horses. The following year, when most of her contemporaries were attending school, she remained at home and was taught to read by her mother. The York's second daughter, Margaret Rose, was born on the 21st of August 1930 at Glamis Castle, the Scottish estate of her mother's parents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her parents felt so sure the child would be a boy that they had no girls' names ready. Elizabeth announced she would call her sister Bud. When asked why, Elizabeth responded, "Well, she's not a rose yet, is she? She's only a bud." If Margaret had been a boy, Elizabeth's importance would have waned, as the law of primogeniture, still in place then, meant the younger male child would have taken precedence in the line of succession. In fact, Margaret's birth brought the York family, that her father dubbed We Four, into sharper focus. George V's illness had taken a great toll on him, but his obdurate heir, the popular 36-year-old Prince of Wales, showed no sign of settling down with a suitable bride and starting a family of his own. His offspring would have taken precedence in the line of succession to the throne. George V had little time for his other sons. The love the Prince of Wales felt towards twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson not only caused a rift between the king and his direct heir, but growing concern among government ministers and leading establishment figures. By now, George V had come to the conclusion that the Yorks were a safe pair of hands, and that in Bertie, despite his speech impediment, there was a man of inner strength who had the courage to be a leader. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, despite their tender ages, could not be shielded from the growing tensions within the family. But they were perhaps too young to fully understand how the unfolding abdication would one day impact on their young lives. To them, the Prince of Wales was their golden-haired favourite Uncle David, a charming, mischievous, joyful man who around them was above all always fun to be with. They would spend hours with him miming the characters in A. A. Milne's best-selling Winnie the Pooh, and they simply adored him. For the Duke of York, the situation had become intolerable. The prospect of him becoming king in place of his older brother, should David abdicate his responsibilities, filled him with dread. In 1936, which was to become known as the Year of the Three Kings, his worst nightmare would come true, and his blissful private world and that of his young family would change forever. Over Christmas 1935, George V's health deteriorated rapidly, and he developed a debilitating viral respiratory infection. 8 years earlier, on the 9th of December 1928, the king, who suffered from bronchitis and numerous lung problems throughout his later life, had only been spared death by the skilled intervention of his physician, Sir Bertrand Dawson, who located and drained the abscess that had gravely complicated an attack of pleurisy. That crisis and the long months of recovery inspired a surge of popular feeling towards him and the crown he served. Now ennobled, Lord Dawson of Penn could do very little to help the king, apart from making him comfortable in his final hours of life. Years later, it emerged that as the king lay comatose on his deathbed in 1936, his personal physician injected the monarch with fatal doses of morphine and cocaine to ensure a painless and timely death, according to his own notes, for the announcement to be carried in the morning papers rather than the less appropriate evening journals. This remarkable act of royal euthanasia remained a secret for half a century, until, in 1986, it was revealed that he administered the 2 lethal injections at about 11 p.m. on the 20th of January 1936. An hour and a half earlier, Dawson had written a classically brief and now famous medical bulletin that declared, "The King's life is moving peacefully towards its close." The physician had already taken the precaution of phoning his wife, Minnie Ethel, in London, to ask that she advise the Times to hold back publication. The next morning, the 21st of January, under the headline, "A Peaceful Ending at Midnight," the Times led the tribute to the monarch. Lord Dawson was satisfied, too, that he had played his part in ensuring such important news was published in the newspaper of record and the other morning newspapers, rather than the less appropriate evening journals. George V's death at 70 was not unexpected. He had been a very heavy smoker all his life.